Stacy had always been the shadow behind Alfred's successes, the silent architect who never demanded credit, the woman who stitched together the gaps he left in his ambitions without uttering a word. In the early glow of their marriage, when hope burned brightly, Stacy had willingly folded her wings, giving up a thriving consultancy career few knew she once ruled. It was an empire she built on her intelligence and grit, advising executives and managing elite portfolios. But she dismantled it all for love, for a man she believed would appreciate the unseen sacrifices she made. Alfred never asked, but Stacy offered it anyway, expecting that one day, in a quiet moment of reflection, he would realize the depth of what she gave up. But as the years crawled forward, the reality dawned heavy and cold. Alfred didn't see her sacrifices. He didn't know the weight she carried. And worse, he didn't care enough to ask. Still, Stacy kept her secrets tucked safely behind calm smiles and lowered eyes. At every gala, every dinner, every networking event, she stood silently by Alfred's side, her hand delicately curled around his arm as he spun tales of his brilliance. She watched him recount his climb from obscurity to respectability, omitting her part entirely. Couldn't have done it without a little luck, Alfred often said with a wink at the crowd, never once acknowledging the woman who had been that luck, the woman who had drafted emails, arranged introductions, and soothed difficult clients behind closed doors. Stacy smiled, clapped politely, and accepted the role he cast her into, the invisible wife. Yet deep within, her heart began to carry invisible scars, silent bruises left by the knowledge that she was not cherished, only tolerated. And beneath that quiet acceptance, something long buried, something sharp and relentless, began to stir awake. Alfred loved to perform for his friends, and they adored him for it. Eric, sharp-eyed and always calculating. Marlene, hungry for status, and Tanya, who hid her jealousy under layers of practiced sophistication, they all circled Alfred like satellites around a sun. To them, Alfred was a man on the rise, a man who needed no one. In their gatherings, usually held at exclusive lounges with dim lighting and expensive liquor, Alfred spun grand stories about his achievements. "Everything I have," he declared one evening, swirling a glass of whiskey, "I earned with these two hands. No leeches holding me back." Laughter rippled through the group. Stacy, standing a few steps behind as if she were an accessory rather than a person, felt the words land with a sting so sharp it took her breath away. Tanya leaned forward, her smile edged with cruelty. "You know, Alfred, you really should have married someone from higher stock," she said, tapping her manicured nails against her glass. Marlene laughed and added, "Someone with a trust fund to match your ambition." The comments floated into the air, heavy and poisonous, yet Alfred merely chuckled, basking in the adoration. He didn't defend Stacy. He didn't even glance at her. Eric, whose gaze often lingered longer than the others, looked uncomfortable, but said nothing. Stacy stood there, frozen in her own humiliation, her heart pounding against her ribs. It wasn't just the insults. It was the betrayal of knowing Alfred allowed them. That night, while Alfred clinked glasses and relished his performance, Stacy stood quietly, her fingers tightening around the hem of her dress, stitching together the first threads of a resolve she didn't even realize she was weaving. Dinner parties became battlefields of unspoken wars, and Stacy learned to wear armor stitched from silence. One evening, at a grand hosted by Marlene, Stacy sat at the far end of a gleaming oak dining table, isolated by invisible walls built from gossip and scorn. Tanya lifted her wine glass, flashing a toothy grin. "Some people are just born to cling," she said breezily, her gaze sliding pointedly toward Stacy. The group erupted into laughter, their polished forks clinking against porcelain, their laughter echoing far louder in Stacy's ears than the music playing in the background. Alfred didn't even blink. He raised his glass in a silent toast, smiling as if the comment were harmless banter. Later that evening, as they lounged in Marlene's opulent sitting room, Stacy perched on the armrest of a chair, feeling like an afterthought to a party she was never really invited to. Alfred leaned close to her, whispering with a smirk, "Don't be so sensitive, Stace. They're just teasing." His breath smelled of aged whiskey, and his words, casual, dismissive, scraped raw across the already bleeding wounds in her heart. Stacy managed a small smile, tucking her real feelings behind a veil of grace. But inside, something shifted. She realized that night that these people, including the man she once thought her partner, didn't value her, didn't see her. She was an accessory to their world, easily discarded when inconvenient. And for the first time in a long time, Stacy wondered whether the silence she offered was doing her more harm than good. Marlene's next gathering buzzed with excitement. Her penthouse glittered with gold-accented decor and guests dressed to impress. But there was one notable absence: Stacy. Earlier that day, while arranging Alfred's cufflinks on their shared dresser, Stacy overheard him chuckling on the phone. "She's more of a burden than a blessing," Alfred said to Eric, his voice dripping with casual cruelty. Stacy stood frozen, the delicate silver links slipping from her fingers. She didn't confront him. She didn't cry. She simply folded into herself, the realization cutting deeper than any argument could have. That evening, when Alfred asked if she was ready to leave, Stacy smiled faintly and said, "I'm not feeling well. You should go without me." At Marlene's party, the seat reserved for Stacy remained vacant, a subtle reminder that even shadows leave outlines when they're missing. "Guess she finally realized she's out of her league," Tanya quipped, and the room broke into laughter. Alfred, emboldened by the attention, leaned back in his seat, allowing their mockery to fuel his ego. Eric, ever the observant one, didn't join in this time. His smile was tight, almost regretful. But Alfred was too intoxicated by his own myth to notice the subtle cracks beginning to form. Back at home, Stacy sat in the garden she once nurtured, wrapped in a blanket against the night chill. Above her, the stars blinked silently, and for the first time she realized how peaceful it was to sit alone, untouched by cruelty, unseen by disdain. That night, a seed of something powerful was planted in Stacy's heart, and it began to grow in the fertile soil of her solitude. With Stacy retreating further into silence, Alfred grew more reckless. He paraded himself as the self-made man among his friends, embellishing stories of hardship and triumph while reducing Stacy's contributions to jokes at her expense. "You have to know how to choose the right accessories," he joked once at a bar with Eric and a few others. "A good watch, a sharp suit, and a wife who knows how to smile and stay out of business." The laughter that followed was loud and cruel, but Alfred didn't care. He mistook Stacy's absence, her refusal to fight back, as weakness. He didn't see the quiet calculations behind her eyes, the way she listened more than she spoke, the way she was no longer investing emotions into a sinking ship. Alfred's friends encouraged him further. Marlene once leaned close during a party and murmured, "You're the real star, Alfred. She's lucky you even keep her around." Tanya, emboldened, added with a grin, "If she were my husband's wife, she'd be serving cocktails, not sipping them." Stacy, standing a few feet away, caught every word. But she didn't flinch, she didn't cry. She only smiled, the kind of smile that no longer reached her eyes. Deep inside, Stacy was already setting the stage for a performance they would never forget. They thought they were winning, but they were playing against a woman who had once built empires and was about to reclaim her crown. Stacy sat by the window that evening, staring at the flickering city lights beyond the glass, the soft hum of the world outside mocking the loud silence that had settled between her and Alfred. She had spent so many years loving a version of him that no longer existed, or perhaps had never existed at all. The realization seeped into her bones slowly, painfully, as she folded her arms over her chest and tried to remember the last time she had laughed, truly laughed, without feeling like a shadow at the edge of someone else's spotlight. Alfred breezed past her, talking loudly on the phone, discussing investments and plans, never once glancing at her. "You have no idea how much I carry alone," he said into the receiver, a sentence so heavy with irony that Stacy almost laughed aloud. Instead, she closed her eyes and let the ache settle deeper. Love had always been her gift, her offering to him, but now it felt like a wound she had inflicted on herself, a foolish gamble with a man who believed himself too grand to see the woman who once built him up when the world barely knew his name. That night, as Alfred snored carelessly beside her in bed, Stacy lay wide awake, her mind swirling with broken promises and forgotten vows. She remembered how he used to touch her face and say, "You're my greatest treasure," back when success was still a distant dream. Now, he touched nothing but his own reflection. "Maybe I was never enough for you," Stacy whispered into the darkness, not expecting an answer. Her fingers trailed over the sheets between them, the space that had grown wider with every silent dinner and every dismissive laugh at her expense. In the hollow ache of that night, Stacy realized that her loyalty had become her prison, and she was the one holding the keys. Tears slipped silently down her cheeks, not from anger, but from mourning. Mourning the woman she used to be before she gave everything away to someone who had long since stopped deserving it. She turned her back to him, and, for the first time, didn't feel guilty about choosing herself over a man who had chosen his pride long ago. In the days that followed, Alfred's arrogance swelled like an overfed balloon. At another one of their so-called elite gatherings, the conversation, as always, steered into dangerous waters. Marlene twirled her wineglass between her fingers, shooting Alfred a sly glance. "You really could have done better, Alfred. You need a woman who carries weight, one that matches the empire you're building," she said, loud enough for those nearby to catch every word. Tanya, sitting cross-legged beside her, chimed in with a smirk. "Someone whose last name opens doors, not just stands behind them." The room chuckled softly, some faces feigning politeness, others openly reveling in the cruelty. Alfred shrugged, tossing back a sip of his whiskey. "Well, hindsight's 20/20, he replied carelessly. His words didn't hurt because they were shocking. They hurt because they were exactly what Stacy already knew he believed. But what none of them realized was that words have a way of sticking, of burrowing deep into the fabric of relationships and fraying them from within. In the car ride home that night, the silence was suffocating. Alfred casually tapped at his phone, chuckling at a meme Marlene had sent him, unaware of the storm raging quietly beside him. Stacy stared out the window, her reflection staring back at her like a stranger. She wanted to scream, to ask him how he had come to despise the very woman who had stood by him when he was nothing but ambition wrapped in borrowed suits. But she didn't. Instead, she folded her hands neatly on her lap and said with chilling calmness, "One day, Alfred, you'll understand the price of forgetting who helped you build your castle." He barely looked up, grunted something non-committal, and went back to his phone. Stacy didn't need his acknowledgement anymore. She needed a plan. And somewhere deep inside her chest, where heartbreak used to live, resolve began to take root. Eric was many things, arrogant, sharp-tongued, and occasionally cruel, but he wasn't blind. He noticed things others didn't, like the way Stacy's laughter had disappeared, or the way her eyes no longer sought Alfred's approval across crowded rooms. One afternoon, while Alfred and Eric grabbed drinks alone at a rooftop bar, the city stretching endlessly beneath them, Eric leaned back in his chair and gave Alfred a look that cut sharper than any insult. "You're playing a dangerous game," he said quietly, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. Alfred laughed it off, clinking his drink against Eric's. "Relax. Stacy's harmless. She should be grateful. I gave her a life she couldn't dream of." Eric raised a brow. "Are you sure about that?" he asked, his voice laced with something heavier than mere curiosity. "You don't even know what she's capable of." Alfred brushed him off with a scoff, but the words settled somewhere uneasily in the back of his mind. "She's too soft. Always has been," Alfred muttered, sipping his drink. Eric didn't argue. He simply watched his friend, the way a man watches a ticking clock he knows will soon chime a warning. "You don't see it because you don't want to," Eric said finally, his tone grim. "But not all storms announce themselves with thunder first. Sometimes it's the quiet ones that tear everything apart." Alfred laughed louder, slapping Eric on the back, already dismissing the conversation. But for the first time, doubt flickered briefly across his features before he masked it with bravado. Meanwhile, miles away, Stacy stood at the threshold of a new future, one that would soon show them all just how dangerous silence could be. The house that once echoed with conversations and soft laughter had turned into a cavern of cold silence. Stacy moved like a ghost through the corridors, her footsteps soft against the polished wood, while Alfred barely noticed her existence. They had reduced themselves to courteous strangers, exchanging stiff greetings in passing, pretending not to hear the sighs that filled the spaces between them. At dinner, They sat at opposite ends of the long oak table, the clink of cutlery against porcelain louder than any spoken word. "Pass the salt," Alfred would mutter without glancing up, and Stacy, without a word, would slide it toward him like a business transaction. The intimacy they once shared had evaporated into a sterile fog of habit, and neither had the courage, or perhaps the interest, to clear the air between them anymore. Late one night, as rain tapped against the windows, Stacy stood by their bedroom door, watching Alfred snore carelessly on their bed. Her hand tightened around the doorknob, a thousand words battling behind her lips. She thought about waking him, about asking when exactly he had stopped loving her, if he had ever truly loved her at all. But the words, like so many other things between them, died before they could be born. She turned away, pulling a blanket tighter around her shoulders, and made her way to the guest room instead. Curling up alone on a narrow bed meant for visitors, Stacy realized she no longer feared the emptiness beside her. She was starting to prefer it. Outside, the storm raged louder, but within the walls of that house, the real storm had long been brewing, a quiet, ruthless unraveling neither of them dared to confront. A golden envelope arrived the next morning, thick and heavy in Alfred's hands, sealed with an intricate crest. He opened it with an indifferent glance, skimming the contents before tossing it onto the kitchen counter where Stacy stood making coffee. "We're invited to the Holloway ball," he said casually, reaching for his phone. "Not that it matters. Just another excuse for rich folks to show off." Stacy picked up the envelope, feeling the weight of the moment settle into her bones. The Holloway ball wasn't just another event. It was the gathering of the city's most powerful, a night where fortunes were made and destroyed in whispers and glances. She turned the card over thoughtfully, the crisp lettering glinting in the morning sun. "Are you planning to attend?" she asked, her voice calm. Alfred shrugged, not even looking up. "Of course. It's important for networking. Just try not to draw too much attention," he added absently, flipping through his emails. Stacy bit the inside of her cheek to keep her composure. Once again, he saw her as a liability rather than a partner. She tucked the invitation under her arm, her mind already racing ahead. "I'll make sure I'm invisible enough for you," she said quietly, the sarcasm so well disguised that Alfred didn't even catch it. As he walked away, already consumed by work calls, Stacy stood frozen, the steam from her coffee rising between her and the cold truth of their marriage. But behind her composed exterior, a different fire had ignited. If he thought she would arrive meekly at that ball, he was about to be profoundly mistaken. Stacy smiled to herself, a slow, dangerous smile. The Holloway ball would not just be another night of humiliation. It would be the night she rewrote the ending to the story he had tried to erase her from. The air in the cafe smelled of roasted coffee beans and possibility. Stacy sat across from an older woman, elegantly dressed in a navy blue suit, her silver hair pinned neatly at the nape of her neck. Margaret Holloway had been more than just a mentor years ago. She had been a lifeline. When Stacy left her career behind to marry Alfred, Margaret never judged. She had simply hugged her tightly and said, "Remember who you are," even when they forget. Now, staring into Margaret's wise eyes, Stacy felt the dam inside her crack. "I think I forgot who I was, Margaret," Stacy whispered, stirring her untouched tea. Margaret reached across the table, her hand warm and firm atop Stacy's. "You didn't forget, dear. You just put yourself on hold for someone who stopped listening. It's time you pressed play again." Their conversation stretched on, filled with laughter and heavy moments of painful truth. Margaret listened as Stacy poured out years of silent betrayals and invisible wounds. "You gave up everything to build his dreams," Margaret said quietly. "Now build yours." Stacy nodded, feeling something deep within her settle into place. Before they parted, Margaret slipped a sleek black card into Stacy's palm, an invitation of sorts, but not to a party. It was an offer to return to the circles she once ruled, a network of influence she had abandoned but could reclaim whenever she chose. "Come back to where you belong, Stacy," Margaret said with a soft smile. As Stacy stepped out into the bustling street, the crisp autumn air biting at her cheeks, she felt lighter and heavier all at once. She wasn't just going to attend the Holloway ball. She was going to arrive like a queen returning to her throne. Stacy sat at her vanity table that night, staring at her reflection under the soft yellow glow of the lamp. The woman staring back at her didn't look broken. She looked strangely calm, as if she had crossed a threshold no one could push her back from. Carefully, she removed her wedding ring and set it down on the table, the small metallic clink sounding louder than the storm raging in her chest. Alfred was downstairs, laughing at something on his phone, oblivious to the silent revolution taking place upstairs. Stacy inhaled deeply, her hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from a deep sense of finality. She wouldn't fight for a man who treated her like a burden. She wouldn't cry at parties or beg for scraps of affection. She would go to the Holloway ball, not as a wife seeking validation, but as a woman reclaiming her place in a world she had abandoned for love. "You gave it all away," she whispered to her reflection. "Now you take it back." The next morning, over a breakfast they barely acknowledged each other through, Alfred casually mentioned the ball again. "Don't wear anything flashy, all right? Keep it simple. Sophistication is subtle," he said, buttering his toast. Stacy folded her napkin neatly on the table, her face the perfect mask of obedience. "Of course," she murmured, sipping her tea. But inside her, the decision had already taken root and grown sharp thorns. She wasn't going to shrink herself to soothe his insecurity. No, this time, she would command the room, not with loudness or cheap theatrics, but with elegance so profound they would choke on their own scorn. Alfred didn't notice the slight gleam in her eyes as he scrolled mindlessly through his emails, and Stacy didn't offer him any hint of her plans. After all, the sweetest victories are the ones nobody sees coming until it's far too late. In a corner office high above the city, Stacy sat across from Margaret Holloway and a team of financial advisors, her fingers tapping thoughtfully against the armrest of her chair. "You're sure you want to proceed anonymously?" Margaret asked, tilting her head. Stacy smiled, a slow, deliberate curve of her lips. "Anonymity will make the impact louder," she replied. Within hours, papers were signed, funds transferred, and strategic investments made. Quietly, efficiently, Stacy funneled significant capital into the businesses of Alfred's inner circle, Eric's consultancy, Marlene's event company, Tanya's fashion boutique. They had no idea who was saving them from their mounting debts. All they knew was that a silent angel investor had given them new life. They celebrated their luck, boasting about their revived prospects, never once wondering why success had landed so conveniently in their laps. Later that week, Alfred came home buzzing with excitement. "Eric's business just got a major cash injection," he said, pouring himself a drink. "Same with Marlene and Tanya. Must be our season of favor." Stacy smiled thinly from across the living room. "Must be," she echoed softly. He didn't notice the way her voice caught slightly or the flicker of amusement that danced in her eyes. While he and his friends toasted their mysterious good fortune, Stacy remained invisible, exactly as they had always wanted her to be. But this time invisibility was her armor, her chess move. They were thriving now, oblivious that every coin spinning their way had been flipped by the very woman they dismissed as useless. And when the time came, Stacy knew she wouldn't have to lift a hand in anger. She would only have to lift the veil of her silence and watch everything crumble beneath them. The transformation began subtly. Stacy no longer dressed in muted tones and understated jewelry. Instead, she chose rich colors that complemented her dark skin and flowing fabrics that whispered power with every step. In the privacy of her dressing room, she ran her fingers over the intricate beadwork of a deep emerald gown she had commissioned, not for Alfred's approval, but for herself. Each morning she rose earlier, taking long walks through the manicured parks where the city's elite often gathered. She reconnected with old acquaintances she had left behind, rebuilding bridges silently burned during her years of isolation. "Stacy Morgan," they would say with wide eyes. "We thought you disappeared." She would only smile and reply, "Just taking the scenic route back." At home, Alfred barely noticed the changes. Or perhaps he noticed and chose to ignore them, too consumed with chasing the next appearance of success. Once, while passing by her in the foyer, he paused, narrowing his eyes at the confident way she carried herself. "You're dressing a little extra these days," he commented, a touch of unease creeping into his voice. Stacy tilted her head slightly, her smile soft but laced with something unreadable. "Maybe I just got tired of blending into the wallpaper," she said lightly, stepping past him without waiting for a response. That night, she lit a single candle in her garden, the flame dancing wildly in the breeze. It wasn't a vigil for her marriage, that was already dead. It was a silent celebration, a small ceremony marking the rebirth of the woman she had buried for far too long. The city's social circles buzzed with new rumors, each whisper weaving into the next like an invisible thread, pulling everyone closer to the truth. Talk of a mysterious investor, one whose generosity had revived failing businesses overnight, spread like wildfire among the elite. At a casual brunch Alfred attended with Eric and Marlene, the subject dominated conversation. "I heard the investor is from old money. Someone connected to the Holloways," Tanya speculated, dabbing her mouth with a linen napkin. Eric leaned forward, his voice lowered to a conspiratorial whisper. "Whoever it is, they're not just throwing cash around, they're strategic. Every business touched by them is flourishing almost overnight." Marlene sipped her mimosa, smirking. "Who cares who it is, as long as the money keeps flowing?" Alfred laughed along, but a tiny knot of discomfort twisted inside him. For the first time, he realized he had no idea who truly held the reins anymore, and that scared him. Later that evening, as Alfred recounted the day's gossip at home, Stacy listened quietly while folding a cashmere throw over the back of the couch. "Funny how invisible hands can change the course of someone's fate," she mused, her voice casual. Alfred barely glanced up from his phone. "Yeah, well, good for them. Some people are lucky to have friends in high places," he said dismissively. Stacy smiled to herself, a smile he never caught. His arrogance was his shield, blinding him to the truth dancing right in front of him. As he sank deeper into his own self-importance, Stacy moved silently, weaving herself back into the fabric of a world he had deemed her too insignificant to belong to. The ball was drawing nearer, and so was the moment that would tear the illusion he built apart, thread by careless thread. The night before the Holloway ball, Alfred stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie while Stacy sat on the bed, flipping through a glossy magazine. "Don't wear anything too dramatic," he said without looking at her. "I don't want you attracting the wrong kind of attention." Stacy turned a page slowly, hiding the simmering amusement in her eyes. "Of course, Alfred. I'll make sure I'm completely forgettable," she said sweetly. He grunted his approval, satisfied that she would remain tucked neatly into the background where he believed she belonged. After he left the room, Stacy placed the magazine down and walked over to her wardrobe, her fingers tracing the outline of the garment bag hanging there. Inside it waited the gown she had chosen, a flowing, golden masterpiece that caught the light like molten silk and would command every gaze in the room. Subtlety was no longer her mission, dominance was. Later, as she laid out her accessories, delicate diamond earrings, a matching bracelet, and a single gold hairpin, Stacy rehearsed her poise in the mirror. Her reflection was no longer hesitant. It was regal, untouchable. "You're not doing this to hurt him," she reminded herself softly. "You're doing this to reclaim yourself." Every detail was chosen with precision. The sweep of her hair into an elegant twist, the understated but lethal makeup that highlighted her natural beauty, the fragrance she would wear that left a memory long after she passed. When Alfred later peeked into the room to say he was stepping out to meet Eric, Stacy stood before the mirror in a simple robe, no evidence of the storm gathering quietly beneath her skin. "Be ready on time," he said briskly. Stacy nodded, her eyes calm. Inwardly, she counted the hours until the world he built on her silence would finally fall to its knees. The grand ballroom of the Holloway estate was a vision of splendor, crystal chandeliers dripping from vaulted ceilings, tables adorned with shimmering linens and floral arrangements that perfumed the air with opulence. Stacy arrived hours before the official start, standing quietly at the entrance in her simple coat, blending with the decorators and staff. She needed to see it empty, to see the battlefield before the soldiers arrived. Slowly, she wandered through the rows of golden chairs, running her fingers along the backs, envisioning the faces that would soon fill them. Each step echoed in the cavernous space, a hollow sound that mirrored the loneliness she had carried for far too long. Standing under the massive chandelier, she tilted her head back and whispered to no one. "This will be the last time I ever feel invisible." The room swallowed her words, but Stacy knew the promise had already taken root. As she traced the marble floors with quiet footsteps, the emotions welled up thickly, years of silent endurance, of giving until she was emptied. She thought of every moment she had swallowed her pride, every insult she had masked with a smile, every betrayal she had forgiven without an apology. Tonight was not about revenge, it was about resurrection. She paused near the dais where the night's key speakers would stand and closed her eyes briefly, envisioning herself standing there, owning the space that had once seemed reserved for others. When the event planners arrived, she slipped out unnoticed, her heart steadier, her hands lighter. By the time she returned home, Alfred was sprawled across the sofa, half asleep, a glass of whiskey dangling from his fingers. He didn't stir when Stacy walked past him, her coat still buttoned, her heart no longer weighed down by sorrow. She was ready, and soon, the world would see the woman Alfred had forgotten he once needed more than breath itself. The weeks leading up to the ball were a flurry of excitement for Alfred and his circle. Everywhere they turned, success seemed to greet them like an old friend. Eric's consultancy landed a lucrative corporate contract. Marlene's event company was suddenly booked out for months. Tanya's boutique was featured in a prominent fashion magazine. Over celebratory drinks at an exclusive rooftop lounge, they clinked glasses, their laughter carrying across the night air. "We must be golden right now," Marlene beamed, twirling the stem of her glass between her fingers. Eric leaned back smugly. "It's almost like someone upstairs decided to sprinkle blessings all over us," he joked. Tanya giggled and added, "Maybe our good karma is finally paying off." Alfred basked in the glow of association, proudly boasting, "I told you, when you move with the right people, good things follow." None of them questioned the sudden wave of fortune. Arrogance had blinded them to the idea that blessings often came with a price. Meanwhile, Stacy watched from a distance, her presence unnoticed yet omnipresent. She heard the stories secondhand. Alfred recounting the wins at dinner, Marlene flashing new designer purchases during brunches, Tanya talking about expanding her brand internationally. Their success fueled their cruelty even more. They sneered louder, laughed harsher, and belittled more openly, assuming their rise proved their superiority. Stacy absorbed it all, emotionless now, detached from the hurt that once cut so deeply. She knew every dollar buoying their success bore her fingerprints. Not out of kindness, but calculation. "Let them soar," she whispered to herself one evening, gazing out over the city lights. "So the fall will be that much sweeter." There was no rush. Patience was a luxury she finally understood how to wield. Every time they grew more confident, more entitled, they unknowingly walked closer toward the reckoning they had earned with every careless word. One afternoon, Stacy found herself at Marlene's boutique, picking up a small custom order Margaret had recommended. She moved quietly among the racks of glittering gowns, her presence unnoticed until Tanya, Marlene, and a few others gathered near the fitting area. Stacy heard them before they saw her, careless voices rising above the soft hum of the background music. "I bet Stacy's idea of dressing for the ball is pulling out some old church dress," Tanya snickered, loud enough to turn heads. Marlene laughed, her voice sharp. "If she doesn't end up sweeping the floors instead of dancing on them, it'll be a miracle." They all burst into laughter, oblivious to the figure standing just beyond the curtain of a nearby fitting room. Stacy stood still, her fingers resting lightly on a silk sleeve, her expression unreadable. She could have revealed herself, but she didn't. Instead, she smiled faintly and walked away, unseen once again. She didn't need their apologies. She only needed their ignorance for now. At home that evening, Alfred recounted another conversation, chuckling as he slipped off his shoes. "You know, Marlene said you should probably just wear something simple, so you don't embarrass yourself," he said, not even realizing he was twisting the knife deeper. Stacy folded the newspaper she had been reading, setting it neatly on the side table. "Simple," she echoed, her voice calm and even. "I suppose there's dignity in simplicity. Alfred nodded, misreading her as always. Exactly. Just blend in. Stacy stood up, smoothing invisible wrinkles from her skirt. I'll make sure they see exactly what they expect, she said softly, turning away before he could catch the glint in her eyes. Behind the closed door of their bedroom, she leaned against the frame and exhaled slowly. They were so certain she was nothing, so confident in their mockery, that none of them would ever see her coming, until it was far too late. In a private atelier nestled in the heart of the city, Stacy stood before a trio of mirrors as the designer adjusted the final drape of her custom gown. The dress was a masterpiece of craftsmanship. Molten gold silk that hugged her figure before cascading down like a river of light, intricate beading at the shoulders catching every flicker of illumination. You'll silence the room, the designer whispered reverently as she stepped back to admire her work. Stacy's heart pounded, not with nerves, but with a slow, pulsing certainty. She had spent years folding herself into the background, but not tonight. Tonight, she would be unforgettable. As the final pins were tucked and the last adjustments made, Stacy caught her reflection and barely recognized the woman staring back. Poised, unbreakable, breathtaking. When she returned home, she found Alfred in the study, scrolling through emails. He barely looked up. "Did you get something decent?" he asked, half distracted. Stacy smiled quietly, hanging the garment bag carefully in the closet. "It's simple," she said, the understatement of the year. Alfred grunted approvingly, returning to his screen. Alone in the bedroom later, Stacy unzipped the bag and ran her fingers across the gown's gleaming surface, a shiver racing down her spine. The woman who would walk into the Holloway ball wouldn't be the Stacy they pitied or mocked. No, she would be the storm they didn't hear until it shattered the ground beneath their feet. As she closed the bag and switched off the light, Stacy whispered to herself, "Let them laugh now. Their smiles won't survive the night." The Holloway ball was already in full swing by the time Stacy's car pulled up to the grand marble steps of the estate. Inside the opulent hall, chandeliers bathed the glittering crowd in golden light, the soft murmur of conversation blending with the strains of a string quartet. Alfred stood near the bar with Eric, Marlene, and Tanya, laughing boisterously, utterly at ease. They hadn't even thought to wait for Stacy's arrival, confident she would find her own invisible corner to hide in. As Stacy stepped out of the car, the valet's hand trembled slightly when he opened the door, struck silent by the woman before him. Draped in a gown that shimmered with every step, Stacy's presence was magnetic. She moved with an effortless grace, her head held high, a quiet, breathtaking confidence pouring from her like perfume. Every whispered conversation faltered. Every gaze turned and followed her as she entered. Inside, heads began to pivot one by one, the energy in the room shifting as if a sudden current of wind had swept through. Alfred caught the movement first, a ripple through the crowd, and turned lazily to see what the fuss was about. His glass froze halfway to his lips as he spotted her, and for a heartbeat he forgot to breathe. "Who?" Marlene stammered beside him, her voice cracking before her eyes widened in horror. Tanya dropped her champagne flute, the glass shattering unnoticed at her feet. Stacy didn't rush. She let the stares wash over her like a baptism, her every step echoing in the stunned silence. She made her way across the ballroom, without so much as a glance toward Alfred and his friends, who stood frozen in their circle of arrogance, watching the woman they had dismissed rise higher than any of them could have imagined. Tonight, Stacy wasn't simply attending the ball, she was rewriting the entire narrative. Alfred's throat tightened as he watched Stacy float through the crowd, effortlessly weaving into conversations with people he had spent years trying to impress. Margaret Holloway herself greeted Stacy with a warm hug, leading her toward a cluster of city elites. Alfred shifted uncomfortably, tugging at his collar, a sheen of sweat suddenly dampening the back of his neck. "Since when does she know Margaret Holloway?" Eric muttered beside him, his voice tinged with disbelief. Marlene, always quick to mock, now stood pale and silent, clutching her clutch bag like a lifeline. Tanya leaned in, whispering harshly, "Did you know she could pull something like this?" Alfred shook his head, unable to tear his gaze away. The room, which had once felt like his playground, now felt alien and cold. Stacy hadn't just arrived. She had conquered without raising her voice, without announcing her power. That realization gnawed at Alfred's pride, hollowing him out from the inside. Trying to save face, Alfred forced a laugh and said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear, "Well, look who decided to dress up for once." A few scattered, uncomfortable chuckles rose, but no one truly laughed. The spell Stacy cast over the room was too strong, too undeniable. She caught his voice on the air, but didn't flinch, didn't acknowledge it. Instead, she leaned in to whisper something to a prominent business tycoon, who threw back his head and laughed warmly, clapping Stacy on the shoulder as if they were old friends. Alfred felt the ground shift beneath him. Eric glanced at him sideways and muttered under his breath, "You made a mistake underestimating her." And for the first time in a long while, Alfred tasted something bitter and unfamiliar on his tongue, regret, sharp and undeniable, as he realized Stacy was no longer within his reach, not even remotely. The orchestra swelled, and couples moved to the floor in a slow, graceful waltz. Alfred watched helplessly as Stacy accepted a dance from Thomas Hartley, one of the wealthiest financiers in the country, his hands respectful but clearly reverent as they twirled across the marble floor. She moved like royalty, every step effortless, every turn a declaration. Alfred clenched his fists at his sides, forcing a brittle smile onto his face when guests glanced his way. "Act like you're proud of her," Marlene hissed urgently under her breath, sensing the growing whispers around them. But Alfred could barely breathe, let alone act. He had spent so long diminishing Stacy that he had forgotten she was a force long before he tried to cage her. Now she was free, and he was the one imprisoned by his own pride. As the dance ended, Stacy curtsied gracefully, and Thomas bowed with an exaggerated flourish that made the crowd laugh and applaud lightly. Stacy's eyes swept the room, landing briefly on Alfred. She smiled then, not cruelly, not mockingly, but with the kind of devastating pity one reserves for someone too blind to save themselves. That smile gutted Alfred more than any harsh word could have. Across the room, Tanya gripped Marlene's arm, her voice panicked. "We're losing control," she whispered. Marlene nodded stiffly, her mind racing for a way to salvage their standing. But there was no salvaging anything tonight. Stacy hadn't just risen, she had erased them, rendered them irrelevant in a world they once ruled through arrogance and mockery. And the night was far from over. The ballroom buzzed with a different kind of energy now, a low hum that had nothing to do with the music or the champagne. Somewhere between the clinking glasses and the soft shuffle of heels across marble, the rumors started. It began with a whispered conversation between two CEOs near the bar, then drifted to a group of journalists who had caught wind of something more tantalizing than fashion statements. The anonymous investor everyone's been talking about. "She's here tonight," someone murmured, their voice barely above a breath. The words spread like wildfire, igniting curiosity and turning every head in the room. Stacy stood at the center of it all, poised yet unreachable, as if she had orchestrated this very moment without uttering a single command. Alfred, sensing the shift, furrowed his brow and leaned toward Eric. "What are they talking about?" he asked tensely. Eric, whose face had grown increasingly unreadable, only shrugged. "Guess we're about to find out." Near the grand dais, Margaret Holloway approached the microphone, tapping it lightly to get the crowd's attention. "Good evening, esteemed guests," she said with a gracious smile. "Tonight, before we continue, we would like to take a moment to acknowledge someone very special among us. Someone whose quiet generosity has revitalized businesses, supported dreams, and empowered futures anonymously until now." A ripple of anticipation rolled through the room, dozens of faces turning expectantly toward Margaret. Alfred's stomach twisted painfully as Margaret continued. "Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to finally reveal the benefactor behind the transformation we've witnessed these past months." She paused, her eyes twinkling as they found Stacy in the crowd. "Please join me in recognizing Mrs. Stacy Morgan." The room went deathly still, every conversation cut mid-sentence. And in that charged, breathless moment, Alfred realized his world had just been turned inside out, and there was no undoing it. The applause started hesitantly, a few polite claps that quickly grew into a thunderous ovation as Stacy, serene and commanding, walked toward the stage. Each step she took was a quiet rebuke to the years they had spent underestimating her. As she ascended the few marble steps, the room shimmered with attention so thick it could have been cut with a knife. Standing before the microphone, Stacy let the applause wash over her before lifting one elegant hand for silence. The crowd obeyed instantly. Her voice, when it came, was soft yet piercing, carrying across the vast room with the authority of someone who no longer needed permission to be heard. For years, I believed my value was determined by how small I could make myself to fit inside other people's stories, she began, her eyes sweeping the room, pausing just briefly on Alfred and his circle. But tonight I reclaimed my voice. There were no theatrics, no bitterness, only a calm, devastating dignity that made the confession even more powerful. The investments you have all benefited from were never about charity, Stacy continued. They were about restoring opportunities that arrogance had nearly destroyed. They were about proving that strength often wears the quietest face in the room. Her gaze lingered on Marlene, Tanya, and Eric, who stood stiff and pale, their previous mockery now a chain dragging heavily around their necks. Turning back to the larger audience, Stacy smiled gently. To those who doubted, thank you. You taught me that sometimes silence is the most powerful language of all. But tonight, I choose to speak. With a graceful nod, Stacy stepped back from the microphone, her speech complete, her message irrevocably delivered. The applause that followed shook the chandeliers, and Alfred, standing among the wreckage of his own illusions, could do nothing but watch, as the woman he once called a burden became the standard by which they would all be measured. The moment Stacy left the stage, she didn't retreat into the crowd. Instead, she moved toward a group of investors and executives who welcomed her with open arms, their smiles genuine, their admiration palpable. Alfred tried to push through the crowd toward her, but the sea of bodies, people who now saw Stacy as an equal, not an accessory, seemed to close around her protectively. Marlene hissed from behind him, "We have to do something." But what could they possibly do now? Stacy had spoken, and no amount of scrambling could erase the truth now carved into the room's memory. Meanwhile, Tanya's face crumpled, her voice barely a whisper. "We mocked the very hand that fed us," she said, her mascara smudging as she wiped at her eyes. Eric, for once, remained silent, a deep frown furrowing his brow as he realized just how badly they had all miscalculated. In the chaos of shifting loyalties, Alfred finally saw the full collapse of the world he had built on shallow foundations. Sponsors whispered to each other, some discreetly slipping away from his circle to join Stacy's new orbit. Invitations rescinded themselves without a word. Contracts that had once seemed certain now dangled by threads. And Stacy, radiant and untouchable, didn't even look back once. She didn't need to. She had outgrown the shadows they had tried to trap her in. Alfred stood there amid the crumbling facade of status and pride, his hands empty, his future uncertain. The house he thought he had built with charm and ambition was nothing more than sand. And Stacy, the true architect of everything that had mattered, had finally chosen to walk away before it could bury her too. The morning after the Holloway ball was like waking up after an earthquake. News outlets and social media were ablaze with articles about Stacy Morgan, the silent investor, the woman who had turned the city's business scene upside down. Headlines screamed her triumph, praising her elegance, her intelligence, her quiet rise to dominance. Meanwhile, Marlene's phone buzzed nonstop, not with praise, but with cancellations. A major event she was coordinating pulled out without explanation. Tanya's boutique saw a drastic drop in orders after a sudden wave of bad press surrounding her mistreatment of a prominent philanthropist's wife. Eric's clients, once loyal, now grew suspicious, some requesting to dissolve partnerships. At a hastily arranged brunch, the three sat together, nursing bitter drinks, their faces drawn. "We underestimated her," Eric admitted grimly, staring into his coffee. Marlene slammed her fist onto the table. "She destroyed us," she spat, and she didn't even raise her voice. At that same hour, Alfred sat slumped in his home office, refreshing his inbox obsessively. The emails that once flooded in, requests for partnerships, invitations to exclusive meetings, were now replaced by polite rejections or chilling silence. Sponsors he thought secured forever were suddenly restructuring or reviewing their associations. Alfred ran a trembling hand through his hair, the weight of his downfall pressing against his ribs like a vice. He couldn't even pick up the phone to call Stacy. Not after the way she had moved through that ballroom. Not after how she had revealed herself without a single petty word. He had called her a leech in front of friends. Now those same friends scrambled to distance themselves from him, desperate not to be tainted by the stink of his ruin. Alfred realized with growing horror that he hadn't merely lost his wife. He had lost everything tethered to the illusion he had built. And Stacy, she had only just begun. Days turned into weeks, and the freefall continued without mercy. Alfred's bank account, once steady and promising, began to hemorrhage from lawsuits, broken contracts, and penalties triggered by clauses he had barely skimmed when he first signed them. Invitations to elite gatherings disappeared. Even those who had once praised him now turned their backs politely, pretending not to recognize him at public events. At a board meeting for one of the projects Stacy had quietly funded years ago, Alfred was informed that his services were no longer required, delivered with crisp professionalism that offered no room for argument. Sitting alone in his car afterward, he stared at the steering wheel, too numb even to curse. His phone rang. It was Eric. For a second, Alfred thought it might be a lifeline. Instead, Eric's voice was terse. "It's done. We're severing ties, Alfred. No hard feelings, but business is business." The line went dead before he could even reply. At home, the silence was worse. Stacy's presence was gone, yet it lingered in every polished surface, every empty corner. He roamed from room to room like a man looking for pieces of himself he couldn't glue back together. Sitting on the edge of the bed they once shared, Alfred buried his face in his hands. He remembered how he used to laugh about Stacy being a burden, how he mocked her sacrifices without shame. Now, stripped of his status, his reputation, and his allies, he understood the truth too late. He had never been the strength of their union, he had been its weakest link. In his arrogance, he had built a castle out of glass, and when Stacy stepped away, it shattered into dust. No apology would fix this. No plea for forgiveness would rewrite the history he had forged with cruelty and ignorance. And deep in his hollow chest, Alfred felt the slow, aching birth of regret, the kind that didn't heal. Across the city, Stacy stood on the sun-drenched balcony of her new penthouse apartment, overlooking a skyline that seemed to bow to her resilience. Dressed in a flowing cream silk robe, she held a cup of herbal tea in one hand, her other arm wrapped lightly around her waist. The cool morning breeze teased a few strands of her hair across her face, but she didn't mind. The battle was over. She had reclaimed herself without throwing a single stone. Margaret's mentorship had opened doors, but it had been Stacy's quiet strength that had carried her through them. Behind her, her new home gleamed. Artwork from local black artists adorned the walls. Bookshelves lined with works that had once inspired her ambition now flanked the sitting room. She was not just surviving, she was thriving in a life she had designed with her own hands. Her phone chimed. A message from Margaret. "Proud of you. Welcome back to the world you belong to." Stacy smiled, her heart swelling with a kind of peace she hadn't felt in years. She walked inside, setting her tea down as she reviewed her calendar, a meeting with new investors, a charity art gala she would attend as a keynote speaker, a lunch with influential women leaders. Her future was full, but never again would it be defined by someone else's shadow. She had learned that silence, wielded wisely, could be a roar louder than any scream. As the sunlight poured into the room, Stacy whispered to herself, "Never again will I forget who I am." And somewhere in the distance, as the world turned and new opportunities blossomed, Stacy stepped forward, not with vengeance, but with purpose, leaving the ruins of her old life far behind her. Months later, fate orchestrated one final meeting. Stacy attended a prestigious gala honoring philanthropic entrepreneurs, her presence requested personally by the board. She moved through the room with ease, her laughter genuine, her grace unmistakable. Alfred, a guest by virtue of another's pity, lingered near the back, half hidden behind a marble column, his tailored suit unable to mask the hollowness he carried. When he caught sight of Stacy, something inside him twisted painfully. She was a vision, glowing, magnetic, untouchable. She didn't see him at first. She didn't need to. But as if sensing the weight of his gaze, Stacy eventually turned. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and for a single heartbeat, time froze between them. Alfred raised his hand slightly, as if to wave or approach, but Stacy only smiled, a soft, pitying smile that spoke volumes. She didn't beckon. She didn't turn away in anger either. She simply acknowledged him with the grace of someone who no longer carried old battles in her heart. And then, with the ease of a woman who had nothing left to prove, she turned and walked away, her gown flowing behind her like a banner of victory. Alfred lowered his hand slowly, feeling the finality of that moment sink into his bones. She had moved on not in anger, but in peace. The silence she left behind him roared louder than any confrontation could have. It was the sound of freedom, the sound of a woman who was never a leech, but a queen he had been too blind to cherish. Here's the Bible verse for the story meaning. Just like Stacy, the verse reflects how strength isn't always loud. Sometimes, true power is found in staying composed while allowing God and time to reveal the truth. Moral of the story: true strength lies not in loud confrontation, but in quiet resilience. Those who mock what they do not understand will one day watch it rise far beyond their reach. Never dim your light to fit into someone else's shadow. Your worth is not diminished by their blindness. In silence, with dignity, you can build a victory so complete that even your enemies are left speechless. That's the end of the story. What did you learn from this story? Drop your thoughts in the comments section. Leave a like and don't forget to subscribe and turn on post notification so that you'll be notified whenever we drop our next videos. Also, share this video to someone who might be interested. Thank you so much for watching.